Okay, guys, so today I'm here with Rob Larson, and we're going to discuss socialism, some common objections against socialism, some common arguments in favor of socialism. So, Rob, if you could just introduce yourself, give us a brief introduction.
Yeah. Hi, everybody. Professor Rob Larson here. I've been teaching economics for almost 16 years now. I was young at one time. It was exciting. And I write about economic issues a lot. I have a couple of books out about them. The last one was Bit Tyrants, the Political Economy of Silicon Valley, looking at the economic reasons and the market incentives that led us to have these all-powerful Silicon Valley towering bastards of the economy like Amazon and Google. There's reasons they're monopolies. It's kind of interesting. And the last one before that was Capitalism versus Freedom, the toll road to serfdom, which we'll probably talk more about today. And I'm the house economist at Current Affairs Magazine, which people should also check out.
Great, cool, man. Thanks a lot. So yeah, we're just going to get right into it. The first question is, what is socialism? Now, I know a lot of socialists sometimes don't like this question because, it's a bundle of philosophies. There's a lot of different approaches to socialism, but it seems like the general consensus is the suspicion of economic hierarchy and giving workers more power. So if you kind of want to expand on that, give us your definition.
Yeah, right on. So yeah, like any other big political school, there's tons of perspectives on it and people disagree about exactly what it refers to, and everyone likes to paint the ones they don't have in the most uncharitable possible light. But usually there are like one or two kind of core ideas in any kind of political system. With capitalism, you have markets and private property. Like those are kind of like the key ingredients there. And with socialism, usually it's more about ideas of equality or egalitarianism, like they say, and worker control, right? So worker control of the means of production is kind of like one of the big banners of traditional socialism there. Means of production refers to like everything we use to make all the products we get to enjoy, like all the factories and oil refineries and cloud computing centers, the big scale, what we call capital in an economy, the productive capital assets. That's what corporations own and that they use to make a profit and so on. Socialism historically was saying, right, capitalism, capitalism says it builds up the economy and it invests and you get exponential economic growth. And that's pretty true. Like it comes at giant costs to climate and species richness, and you get this crazy ruling class, but it does bring economic growth. The idea with socialism was, okay, great, capitalism has built up these means of production. We have this huge $20 trillion GDP like we have in the US.
Right.
That's great. We have this ability to produce goods, and yet so many of us are sleeping on the streets and no one can afford all their health care, and people are doing GoFundMe for their insulins. And meanwhile, our ruling class now, who have so much of the accumulated wealth of this huge economy, they're so wealthy, they have like personal space programs. Like it's an outrageous waste of our assets at a time when there's holes in the road and people living on the streets and we need healthcare and there's climate problems we could think about addressing. So socialism says, hey, we have like the ability to satisfy these problems, and yet we're using all that wealth. We're putting in the hands of a tiny number of people who own the corporate economy. Shares in public companies are mostly held by the rich. Socialism says those should be publicly run companies. They're very big and important, like your oil refineries and data cloud centers and essential entities like that. They may need to be like publicly owned, but the big thing with socialism has always been worker control.
Worker control,
economic democracy in some form. That leaves a lot of like room to experiment, and we should have like an open to experimental attitude rather than trying to lay blueprints on every living soul. But those are just sort of the principles that a lot of socialists would say are kind of at the core of that political idea and why it's useful.
Right. So it seems like socialists want to break up that, the notion of private property as well, right? Would you say that's the general consensus?
Totally. But again, here it's like with all these political terms, like they're very mushy. Putting out of philosophy, like how easy it is to turn one idea like into its opposite meaning if you use your crafty human language to twist things around, like it can be done. The private property, people think of like their personal shit. People think of their toothbrush in their personal car. If you're a homeowner, which used to be most of the society and not really true anymore.
Yeah.
But if you own some property, like that's important to people, and people want their personal junk, and when we talk about private property in the context of the economic system like this, like socialism and capitalism, we're talking about the big scale private property. Who owns like
These,
the gas pipelines that let people heat their homes?
yeah,
It comes from some
like
place or
these large corporations.
yeah, or
Yeah.
drilling gas. Like these are huge pieces of property. They're mainly owned by like shareholders because
And a
they're part
small
of a large
minority
collective
owns
entity.
this, right? And they, yeah, yeah. And
Exactly. So when we talk
yeah,
about private property, then like that's what we're talking about, though. Just to be clear about that, like we're not talking about your personal toothbrush or even like your personal like
yeah.
house. Like
I think
we,
that's crucial too
yeah,
to
we
bring
often
up
call
because I
that
meet so
personal
many,
property, yeah, instead of
yeah,
property.
right. Because I encounter so many people and they'll say to me, well, socialism state, they want to take our property from us. And like you said, it's not your toothbrush, it's not your shoes, your car. They're talking about these large corporations that
Yeah.
are, very powerful and they're controlled by a small minority of people.
Yeah, you know how it is. Like socialists are always coming and trying to take away your personal cadmium mine, your personal, chemical factory. That's very hurtful when companies do that to you. Like we're talking about assets that are owned by wealthy people, and as soon
Yeah,
as you
right.
hear it in those terms, you're like, I don't own any piece of any corporate empire and its huge physical assets. I
Yeah.
don't own a shipping company or an agricultural commodities trading company. Like these are giant entities. And again, the big thing we do in economics is talk about how efficient markets are. We take a lot of assumptions though into, as granted when we build our models showing that. One of the big ones is competitive markets. We assume we don't have any big entities, like any big monopolies or anything like that, or oligopolies with a couple
Yeah.
of big companies like the telecom
Mhm.
carriers or something like that.
Right.
Those markets are very concentrated and those entities are very powerful. And again, they're belong to a wealthier class of households. This is kind of the perspective that you would have if you were a socialist looking at issues of private property.
Okay, cool, man. Great. Um, so question two, this is another really common one. Where has socialism worked? This is another objection that I encounter. People will say, well, it hasn't worked anywhere and it's just failed. It's just been an abysmal enterprise. So what would you say about that?
Yeah, well, it's difficult to point to cases because you got to remember when you have a social systems don't just go like, okay, people, our day is done, goodbye. Like systems create big institutions and people who benefit from them. You'll get institutions and you have elites who run them or have the controlling interest in them. And they're not usually interested in giving up their control over whatever system we're talking about. The feudal lords didn't go lightly. Like it took a lot of wars with kings to just get the centralized state. And
Right.
then for rising merchants in the capitalist class to come and gradually supplant kings and support parliaments through revolutions and shit like that. So you usually end up with like pieces of systems, like in Western Europe, a huge amount of like the ideals of public programs for equality
Mhm.
are very successful. And in Canada and the UK, even under godforsaken Boris Johnson, like he knows that being pro NHS is essential for him, their national health system, because even in a relatively, business oriented economy like ours in Britain, like the national health system, their public health insurance and actually public healthcare system is one of their most beloved assets. And it's so important. It's like what they call a third rail in politics, like Social Security here, our much smaller little public pension program. Like these are often some of the most popular things that governments do. Like in the United States, it's the military and Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security. Like those are the most popular programs all the time because people like those social democratic programs, like steps you
Yeah.
could say represent a steps toward a more socialist economy, at least towards that goal of equality. None of this brings us closer to the real socialist idea of actual worker control of
Ah,
of
okay.
the economy, right? That is kind of the
Yeah.
big socialist ideal. There are ways to do that. Germany makes their big companies have worker representatives on their board, which brings in some actual worker control, sort of like there's bits of it.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
when you say where has socialism worked, okay, like you get bits of it working everywhere that countries have sort of been independent enough to do it. America is sort of a uniquely business run society, but
Right.
full on socialist, countries or revolutions that bring those in, those things happen and they get crushed by whoever their biggest neighbor is most of the time. Like you have real socialism in Spain during the Spanish
I was
Revolution and
right.
Republican
Right.
period, and it's Hitler and Mussolini. And if they hadn't overthrown it, Britain and France and us probably would have. Like it's very difficult for these kind of things to happen in countries that aren't like at the center of global power. So places like the European Union and the US are kind of the best you can hope for, I think, for real changes in that direction, because we're the ones who, wouldn't be overthrown by another country.
Right, right. So, what would you say? What country currently, right now, is the closest to socialism? So you mentioned like democracy within the workplace. That's what we want to move towards, right? Is that what you would say? So, like Mondragon, Spain, the worker co-ops. Would you say that's a good example of a socialist country?
Yeah, there's lots of cooperatives today that are like doing like a lot of what the core mission of socialism was, which was that democratic, not necessarily grassroots control, but like
Yeah,
fundamentally popular control over the decision making about it. Like, yeah, but also, I mean, yeah, you want to point to a country, it's true. There are examples, I think, historically that get closer to it. And again, always in twisted circumstances. The last couple 100 years have been all about wars. It's very difficult for any entity
yeah,
to avoid getting pulled into these things. And then it's all about military conflict and hierarchies that want to win the war. Like, we're mobilizing the economy to support our war effort, and it's CEOs and generals, and we're back in a
yeah.
very autocratic society at that point. So it's difficult when you have any kind of military conflict poisoning any prospect for people like organizing and wanting to like take on more social responsibility on a grassroots level. But I like to look at the example of Yugoslavia, the early post-war period, where there was like, you had government economic planning, like a top-down like planning body, like you had in like the more dictatorial, Stalinist states like the Soviet Union and others.
Right. Mhm.
But there, like the economic planners, instead of saying, here's the plan, shut up, they said, we have a couple versions of the plan. This one's more consumer goods, but it leaves us kind of an older military. Here, we're splitting the difference. Here, it's more military focused, and or more public or social spending focused. Oops, sorry. And like that was subject to a balloting. Like, there wasn't like, we need socialist planning, so here's the plan. We need central planning, so here is the central plan. It's, we need one of these central plans. Here's 6. I mean, we should choose one of these. Like, that's
Yeah,
for those industries that need national level planning, which is something that I think the coronavirus has really shown us. Like, the amount of coordination that it takes to give us a big producing capitalist economy like this. As soon as anything goes badly wrong, it's completely fucked up. I mean, those ships outside Long Beach, these huge ships that have insanely large profiles on the sea, and they're out in the ocean now because they are backed up like away from the seabed outside of the big ports of California. And here too in Tacoma, where I live, our port is
right.
it's incredible the amount of congestion because of all the COVID disruptions,
Yeah,
So these are the things that show you do have a need for planning. Not everything can be done by you, the worker, going into your workplace and deciding with your buddies what to produce. But confederation and a democratic planning process, you can see different ways of doing it. Mondragon's a cool example.
yeah,
Anything that survives now, though, has to deal with like fighting in the marketplace, where companies are always externalizing costs and being wretched, power mongering bastards and so on. So it's tough in the market place to build a socialist institution. Like, we still have to pay bills and everything. They don't let you out of capitalism just because you don't like it. You still have to pay for that.
Yeah, that's a good point. Okay, question 3. What are your thoughts on Venezuela? That's a real common point. You talk about socialism, people will say, well, just look at what happened there. This doesn't work. So what would you say about that?
For sure, Venezuela is a really interesting case. No one knows any world history, so very quickly about this thing, I go like, well, what do you think about this part? They go, oh, I don't know.
Right.
Any country that like wants to break away from the big global system, which for the last couple centuries has been like a more or less global, capitalist market system, which in the Western world has built up a lot of wealth. Through the imperial system, controlled most of the rest of the world for a long time, which really helps build up that seed capital. That's very useful. But anytime you have an entity like Russia or Cuba or whomever, that wants to break away, like, those countries all were immediately invaded or attacked by the other neighboring countries. It's very difficult to get a fair chance for any social system there. And that includes ones I don't like the Iranian Revolution in '79 that brought in the current, super conservative Islamic government there. Like, that's not to say that revolution was bound to do that, but as soon as evil outside entities are poisoning the process to bring in their favorite bastards as much as they can, very difficult to get a nice outcome there. So Venezuela is an interesting case. For years, UK and US supported dictatorships there after its, of course, Spanish colonial origins as a modern state. Like the Goulart dictatorship was one of the big Cold War dictators that the US installed and kept in power there for many decades. No one remembers that stuff. Then by the early 2000s, you get the military victory that brings in Chavez, but Chavez won a lot of elections that kept him in power. The original, nominally socialist leader in Venezuela there, who died a couple years ago of cancer. And it's an interesting case, he won elections. Like, it was positive because that was at a time when, in the Bush years, if people remember the Iraq War, oil prices were very high. And the thing about developing world countries, like third world countries like Venezuela or any other, they tend to be really reliant on commodity exports, shipping out a raw material or a basic sort of commodity like farm goods or oil or gas or, a nickel or gold or cadmium or whatever they have. Like, that was how they were first developed by the European imperial entities, mostly as resource extraction and captive markets to sell your exports to, which was also historically very important in the history of capitalist economies. So that's
Right.
a pretty big deal. But ever since even those countries gained independence, like a lot of them after World War II or before it, in the case of Latin America, like, those countries were always very poor. And rather than give them aid, or you might argue for reparations after we controlled them for so long, we, the Western world,
Yeah.
and stripped them of resources and starved them frequently. That was a thing that would happen a lot if you look into it. A lot of history there. We'll let it go. But these countries have never had a chance to invest domestically and build up their own higher value added industrial capacity. A couple of states have, mostly in East Asia, like South Korea, Taiwan, and stuff. For historical reasons, we wanted to develop economically in that way, and mostly so that they wouldn't become communist, which was a big concern in that Cold War era. It's very interesting. But as a result, Venezuela at that time had a ton of money coming in because oil prices were so high after the disaster of the Iraq War and there's the price regime of that era. Then fracking comes online the next decade and their economy really crashes because the oil price commodity goes into a pretty heavy doldrum it's still struggling with to this day. But also the US starts sanctioning it. Even though, again, Chavez lost a referenda and accepted his loss, Maduro has not done so. Also, when he was coming into power is when we started sanctioning them. The thing is, people just need to remember the United States built the global financial system after World War II.
Mm.
So if we sanction you, it locks you out of the world economy to a significant degree. So if Russia sanctions you, it's like, well, all right, well, you can't do business with Russian customers or Russian banks. All right, that's not the end of the world. If America locks you out of the global payment processing system, and you can only get the income you can get through smuggling out some of your petroleum, it's pretty economically devastating. Like, if we did that to a developed European country, we could crush their economy pretty good. And this is a country that was just under Chavez, built, having a public jobs movement, mostly all paid for through that petroleum export, because much like us and then the IMF, the global financial entity that we use to sort of control developing world economic policy today, that Chavez was happy to rely on oil and gas exports, just like the imperial powers had previously compelled him to do. It was an easy answer, and back then it was making money. Once that fell off a cliff, it really beat up Venezuela's economy. The West kind of saw an opportunity to squeeze it. And when we put those sanctions on, we were open. The point of this is to make it so unlivable, people rise up. I can't believe it when our government announces that. We've done that a million times. So with Chile and Syria, even. We'll just make the people suffer so much they overthrow the government. Really should think about what we're doing to people.
You're right. Right.
When we say that, it's kind of
incredible. And just because a place says it's socialist doesn't mean it is.
That's the thing,
right?
It's mostly an oil money financed developmental state up until the total end of that oil price boom. Argue about whether it's a bubble. And then that era of punishing sanctions to crush it. No state's going to survive that. Now, Venezuela, you could argue, was moving in a socialist direction, had a big socialist democracy, public jobs, big public education drive. The developing world, a lot of people can't read. I was there briefly during the Chavez era.
Oh, yeah. Okay. Wow.
Workers are struggling to become literate, and they found out what I did, because I also had to teach. This is back when I was a part-timer years ago, and I had to sometimes, when you don't have enough work, none of us are proud of the things we have to do on the streets to get by. But I taught math for a while. Okay. I'm not proud of what I did at that time in my life to get by. You have to do these things.
Absolutely.
Guys are coming by and asking me to check their numbers, because if they can prove this, they can get into a correspondence course and sometimes get a job that takes them out of the fields and stuff. It was a developmental state with some socialist hope in it.
Okay.
That's totally been destroyed by now, of course. Years of sanctions and hyperinflation will kill an economy pretty good. I was lucky to visit when it had an economy. I We're so worried about a ton of friends I have back there. It's pretty terrible to hear
Wow.
what they're going through. This is mostly because of decisions made by the US government, though. Fundamentally, this is a country with something to sell, even when oil prices go up and down.
Right.
They shouldn't be starving like this. Algeria and Kuwait aren't starving like this. It's Venezuela, because we put sanctions on them that bar them from doing anything.
Right. So you wouldn't ascribe, obviously, socialism is not the cause of why they're starving.
Yeah,
Right.
well,
Because a lot of people will ascribe causation to economic systems. When they turn out bad, this is why socialism is the reason why, but they ignore the fact that these, kleptocracies and whatnot. So
it's true.
Yeah.
Knowing a little bit of our history with these countries helps a lot. What about this country that we spent 60 years stomping on and got away from our control 20 years ago, and then we've been just destroying their economy for 10 years.
Right.
They're poor. So that's socialism. You don't know.
Yeah, that's what I hear a lot. It's very, very common objection.
TV news version of history a lot of the time.
Right. Okay. Let's see here. Question 4. Was the 20th century an example of socialism? And, again, another really common objection to socialism. Immediately they think of the bloodshed of the 20th century, and that's specifically because of socialism.
Yeah, right on. That's, a natural question to ask. No one wants more of the 20th century, which is absolutely what this century is so far, by the way, of course. No one wants to continue in it. Here we are. Socialism mostly sits out the 20th century. There's very little worker control of production there. The 20th century is sort of a successor to the 19th. It's about centralization of economic power into monopolies and capitalist markets, and centralization of state power in various forms around the world, depending on their weird regional and local history. But there's not a lot in terms of societies that have tons of equality and tons of popular control over the economic development. That's not very common. Scandinavian social democracy is really closer to the kind of thing socialists are talking about. So at least it has some of our goals of equality and public, programs to provide for everybody and have equality on that public level. And because of heavy progressive taxation, significant level of even economic equality, which you don't have in countries like the US, where a tiny proportion of our society owns more wealth than the other 80%. It's insane,
Yeah, big time.
So socialism in the 20th century, you do see a ton of heinous regimes waving the word socialism around. And idiots who think they're being profound will always say, oh, really? What about Hitler's National Socialism?
Yeah, that's another. Yeah.
What about Stalin's Socialist Soviet Union?
Yeah.
Blowing your mind. You've probably never thought of these things before. And you're like, shit, I never did. Wow. Yeah. Oh my God. Yeah, countries like to use that word because it's a word that represents something a lot of people want, especially in the early part of the last century.
That's a great point.
So,
yeah.
People are like, oh, the Soviet Union, that's socialist. That's Stalin's totalitarianism, killing everybody. Okay, it says socialist in the name. It also says fucking republic in the name. Soviet Socialist republics. And and they had little sham elections where you could choose among candidates from the list from the one party. So it's a sham republic. Everyone immediately understands that. Well, they also have central planning by one of history's most naked, outright dictatorship regimes over many decades, including its most infamous days and its less infamous days later. That is pretty far from socialism there, just like it's far from being a republic. Same is true in North Korea and all these other entities. Socialism is very popular historically. And so countries that hate democracy will say, we're a republic, we're a socialist people's republic. No, you're not. You're just trying to make this thing stink less. And that's pretty good. Now, of course, countries have official ideologies, and ideologies are real. These countries within their hyper totalitarian dictatorships would do socialisty things. They had a gender equality in a way that a lot of these countries had never had before in their conservative patriarchal pasts, and public atheist campaigns and stuff like that.
Yeah.
But the big bonus was total control in these hyper hierarchical institutions. Defending historical hierarchies is what conservatism is about. Socialism, we're trying to have more worker control, more democratic checks on the economy, and less Jeff Bezoses who can decide which city gets to have a fun future and which one.
Yeah.
That's too much power, not enough freedom. That would be part of the socialist.
Right. And that goes back to my point too, that you can say you are X, but it doesn't follow that you are X, right? Even someone like Hitler said that he was a Christian. clearly he was not a Christian.
Yeah,
So
there's fanatical Buddhists
yeah,
in Myanmar that drove out the Rohingya. Like they're guilty of ethnic
right.
cleansing.
Because
It's
if you don't have
fanatical, hyper nationalist Buddhists, and it's like, yeah, Christ and Buddha. And it's
yeah,
like, well, of course, as Buddha said, drive out people who may be Bengali in this country. Like that's
right.
a big part of his teaching, as I recall. It just shows like any nice, beautiful, kind of simple human idea, like worker control or Christian
Yeah.
forgiveness or Buddhist contemplativeness or whatever. Any of these things can get turned into crimes against humanity by assholes who want to twist them into some hyper evil.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's my response to the 20th century. You have these totalitarian dictatorships. You don't have democracy within the workplace at all. And, they can say that they're socialist, but it doesn't follow that they actually are.
Yeah, well, they don't even have equality. I mean, you've got a
yeah. If you don't have equality, if you don't have equality, you don't even strive for
Yeah.
equality, and you strive for separatism and oppression and dominance. Well, then of course you don't have socialism.
Yeah, it's funny too, because like there is like the critique to be made about these ideas of socialism is that this is clumsy and unworkable. Like, great, so everyone gets to vote on which corporation does what and what we invest in. It's going to take forever. We need boards and corporations because they're flexible. They can react quickly. You're going to slow everything down. There's going to be a million meetings to sign off on things. There's already too much of that. And the answer is, well, fuck off. I'm so sorry we're putting leashes on you and your personal space program. And you guys invest in housing, but it's expensive. So you make it to do that. So you make it all for elite housing levels that no one can afford. So we put up buildings and they just sit empty all the time.
Yeah.
Your system's completely irrational, just from that material point of view, let alone all this nice stuff that I like to have, like workforce control and more equality and more democratic, checks in the economy there. So we have some broad feeling like the society isn't just running out of our control all the time.
Right.
That's some of the stuff that we could argue for as well. Obviously there's a lot of pieces here. Socialists argue pretty fiercely about this stuff too, but
yeah, absolutely.
I look at it. My book goes into this in detail. Of course, people can check it out.
Cool, man. Awesome. Okay, so question 5: what is the main difference between socialism and capitalism?
I don't know.
It's a big question, but if you could just maybe weed out, just on the face, the main difference.
Yeah, capitalism, you're looking at an economic system characterized by private property and markets. So who owns that giant farm? Who owns that factory belongs to some person or some company, or the shareholders who own the company, or perhaps something like that. But it belongs to private individuals,
right,
on that key level, right? And you use markets to coordinate the activity. So how much output should the factory or farm make will key it to the demand in the market, because the supply and demand will interact and determine prices in the marketplace through the invisible hand. Like, that's capitalism. And it's built up the economy a lot. It has delivered growth, but it creates this horrible ruling class, and it has huge externalities like melting the climate and destroying species and stuff like that. Mm-hmm. So, ups and downs for that system. Socialism, you're looking at a system characterized by economic equality using solidarity to drive economic activity rather than markets. So like making sure people have an adequate amount of the necessities of life, which we are very, very capable of still doing in the world. Despite our population growth, everyone agrees we produce enough good.
Right. Yeah.
We produce enough food and broad goods, broadly speaking. There are exceptions, of course. To provide for the world's population. We fucking won't do it because those people are all poor. They can't. It's not that we can't produce enough. Poor people are too poor to buy things.
Yeah,
so socialism say that should be what drives production rather than what has high prices, which might be cosmetic surgery and private jets for the rich. Who cares what the rich want? We're going to tax their wealth and use it to pay for these public goods.
Yeah.
That's about public goods, economic democracy, worker control, and kind of the principle of solidarity and equality guiding outcomes. Like, that's sort of supposed to be the guiding decision-making process. Now, again, those are broad outlines. There's a huge amount of difference among countries, and there are different weird histories. And countries blend versions of these things and their other social features, like their religion and their, war landscape, stuff like that. So society is always like this rich mixture, but those are the broad ideas of socialism and capitalism.
Okay. Yeah. Another thing too, some people will argue that capitalism is more aligned with human nature, right? This competitive side of us, this selfish side of us, whereas socialism is just, it's just too utopian to put into practice. What would you say about that?
It's totally wrong, you know.
Yeah.
Like you could say that about any social system, you know. Like
Right.
yeah, so
Yeah.
capitalism because it's human nature because we're selfish and greedy like that. Okay, fine, that is true. But we should have
Yep.
socialism because we have the family and we sacrifice for others. And even if your kid breaks their legs or has a disability, you support them with more resources because they
Yeah.
need more. Like you believe in like equity and fairness and some level of equality in the family. So I guess we should have communism then. Like any social system can point to some aspect of the
That's true.
complex
Yeah.
world of human nature and say,
Exactly.
people like tradition and authority, so be fascist. Like these aren't like arguments. This is just
Yeah.
like this is
Yeah.
one of these incredibly lazy arguments
You're right. I
that
agree.
people
Yeah.
have. Anyone can use it.
I mean, even if we are flawed and selfish and competitive, it doesn't follow that we therefore should support systems of exploitation. Doesn't
Yeah,
follow for a moment.
humans are
And
greedy and aggressive. We can't have a court system
yeah,
where we
right.
settle crimes or get justice for murderers do that. Like it's people are just mean. Like no,
Yeah.
we actually can restrain these things and like slightly
Yeah.
improve the world. We're
There's
always
also
going to have slaves because it's fun to own people. Why?
right,
Get
exactly.
rid of that?
Yeah,
Like,
yeah.
no, we could, you won't. Like that's all
Yeah.
the argument is.
Yeah, there's also this onus on like I said, competition and individualism within the capitalist enterprise. And have you ever read Peter Kropotkin?
Sure.
Yeah, yeah. So I mean, mutual aid. I've read a little bit of it, but it really is a powerful argument that he makes. That he tries to basically undermine the Darwinian enterprise that says, "Hey, no, it's not all about rugged individualism. The strongest species, the ones that flourish, get by through mutual aid and cooperation." So I feel like within capitalism and right-wing thought in general, there's this proclivity to look at human beings as be individuals. It's all your fault that things aren't going right. Just do it yourself. So I don't know if you wanted to touch upon that at all. It's just something I see.
Sure,
Yeah.
yeah, it's fascinating. It's true. Like the world of nature is filled with incredible, horrible struggle. My undergrad was in biology. Like,
Yeah, I've heard you say that before. Yeah, yeah, that's
the
pretty cool,
stuff
man.
you learn studying biology is stuff. So there's stuff that no one should ever learn. Like, there's so much that happens in nature that's just so heinous and so
Yeah,
cruel and so
yeah,
ugly.
for sure.
And often it's individual versus individual. I mean, that's constant. But there are many, many cases where the individual is living in some sort of meaningful animal social framework.
Yeah,
Or plants and other organisms. They share DNA. They literally share DNA. They share DNA and minerals and so on, and plant tree networks. Like that's a common thing we observe. Animals, from insects, up all the way up to the primates. They exist in big groups and they rely on the group to do things for them, and they contribute back to the group. Like
yes,
through a solidarity impulse. They also will often hoard secret resources that they eat. Like they're just like us. Yeah, they're flawed.
yeah,
People claim the socialists want human perfection. Like that's ridiculous. We want an improved social
yeah,
organization. It's very
yeah, yeah,
reasonable to do. Like right-wing people get their demands met all the time on cutting taxes and installing right-wing judges. No one says, "Oh, you're just trying to make the perfect right-wing person." They go, "No, they're trying to change society in a way that they think is good." Like that is also the case with us. It's a lot of goofy talking points people pick up against social change. You always have to watch out for that.
yeah. That's true. That's a good point. Okay, let's see here. Question 6. Does socialism eventually want to graduate to communism? Like, what is the ultimate goal of socialism? What is the end goal?
Yeah, well, again, it's sort of debatable, right? Yeah, saying you're a socialist, like it is. I think about it sometimes. I person who works, tries to write and further the cause of socialist economics and socialist policies and equality across the society. Like all we're trying to do is solve our basic horrible problems of today and get us out of our environmental crisis alive and have some more equality in a stable society where all the economic wealth we have can actually be shared by people, and we make plenty of insulin. We should let people have it. It's a
Yeah,
simple enough thing. And then you think, well, okay, well then what? Well, then it's like all the other things humanity might want to do once we've solved our basic economic / environmental problems of today. As I recall, Marx, I'm not a great Marx scholar, but as I recall, he says something like something on the order of socialism is about solving the animal needs of man. Then we can look at the human needs.
okay,
Humanity.
that's interesting.
I'm sure I'm misquoting and misattributing that. You're young. You research that quote and find out who actually said it and put it up on screen and correct me. That'll be funny.
Yeah.
That's your homework.
Yeah, right. That's my yeah.
That's easy. But so
Yeah.
the point is though, like, yeah, so what comes after this? Well, anything you might do with society once we are out of constant crisis and deprivation mode for most of humanity, for
Right.
most of the developing world, like, development hasn't come, won't at this rate because we keep them in debt forever and we're destroying their environments terribly. Uh, but then, what do we want? I mean, like, kind of the classic modern left answer has been popular in some circles of the left, including your current affairs, is a fully automated luxury gay space communism. We want full gender and racial equality. We want luxurious levels of production of goods and services, and we want spatial, like, space exploration, all the fun. And we want the Star Trek future. Basically, is something that I know I can say that speaks to the hopes of a lot of people on the left, including myself. So that's at least some sort of vision.
Okay. I forget if I was going to add anything onto that. Yeah. So, Rob, what do you think about people who will say, I'm with you that Amazon, Google, these big companies, these big concentrations of power by the small minority. I'm on board to criticize that, but socialism isn't the answer. There's got to be some other way. We don't have to have socialism. What would you say to that? I hear this a lot as well.
Sure. I think there's sort of two things to say there. I mean, the first thing is, like, we've done the socialism isn't the answer before. Like the last time, we did this after we had the Great Depression, and we couldn't, using our nice market economy that we came up in the system with, we had, some income tax after World War One. The Federal Reserve exists, but still looking at a pretty free market economy there, with the 1% owning a third of the U.S. economy. Like, that's pretty insane, And then the Depression comes for 10 years, we can't get out of it. And then the huge government spending program does for the war and all these new social programs on the side as well. And people realize, like, okay, something at least involving a larger state role in the economy. Look at those Europeans after World War II, they're all putting national health care in place, nationalizing some transportation, sometimes energy, sometimes not. We should do some of that. We should have social democracy, and you get public income supports. And if you're out of work, you get, a real unemployment check, not unemployment insurance, where you get a little bit of your whole check. And national health care, which is just such when you get fired, at least you still have your health care. It's a night and day difference just on that level. Well, we didn't do that. We said, well, we have enough money. Everyone can buy it. We'll get healthcare through our employers. We don't need to nationalize things. We're going to be fine. We'll put more limits on our unions right away after their big post-war strike wave than they do in the European Union, what will become the European Union. And what happened is, the neoliberal regime, the Reagan Revolution undid all of that stuff because the ruling class kept their ownership of the corporate world, which was, able gradually to get its antitrust limits, loosened over time, partially through Reagan's actions and all of and then Clinton and all their successors. Like, we left them sort of in control of their private property. Like, we left industry to run the economy, and we just taxed them a lot and regulated them. As public enthusiasm won, and we had a public economic crisis in the 70s of stagflation, they saw their opportunity and they came back and destroyed all that nice stuff. And now you have to pay insane amounts for your co-pays and co-insurance and coverage limits and deductibles. And oh my God, like, that is the Reagan Revolution. That's market private insurance. Like, that comes with all those things. You have national healthcare, you go in and we give you your healthcare and you leave. Shut up. Go focus on your health instead of how you're going to pay this twisted bill that you're going to be confronting, even if you have health insurance,
Yeah.
So the New Deal and its demise in the Reagan Revolution shows what happens when you go, like, well, we can have some public safety net stuff and some social democracy, some nice Bernie Sanders things, some kind of climate programs, but we'll leave capitalism and private property and that large corporate stuff.
Right.
They'll come back. They waited 30 years and came back and crushed it. And they did, like, that's 40 years later, and they came back and crushed the New Deal. They definitely have won that. If you look at what happened to their share of wealth, what happened to the level of corporate concentration, like, they undid it. They won that one. We kept the safety net programs like Medicare, Social Security. They've been whittled away at, but they're too popular to be gotten rid of. It's, the social democracy. It's very popular. You can't quite get rid of that.
Yeah.
But we can undo all the stuff that limited their power at all and their share of the wealth. It's insane. So that's the sort of first thing I would say to the socialism isn't an answer bit. The other bit is, remember, like, socialism is like a good thing. Like, it's a reputable ideology, like Albert Einstein talked about why capitalism has all these serious flaws and how the middle class is very powerful, he would say. And usually we interpret in the social sciences concentrated power as being antithetical to freedom. That's
Right,
the
right.
old
Yeah,
conservative argument of books like Friedman's, Capitalism and Freedom. And I agree with that in Capitalism versus Freedom. I just say that
nice.
shows that capitalism itself is a system of power
Yeah,
and oppression of us in a different way, not as like direct and total as, under feudalism or something, but
yeah.
it is a system of power.
It is. It's
It's
kind of like an
the fact
implicit system of power.
Mhm.
Um,
Yeah, so
if maybe
that's the
that's
other
the yeah. I
is
think so.
Einstein was recognizing that. Orwell talked about how important socialism was to him and how he wanted that goal of equality and freedom. He said that's the goal of socialism.
Right.
People like Malala and and other figures
Yeah.
too. It's amazing if you actually read
There's
people.
so many. Martin Luther King Jr., Helen Keller, I believe, as
Mhm.
well.
And it's not
Yeah,
just what people have said about capitalism, which sort of puts like the real
yeah,
picture in place. Like
right.
Adam Smith in Wealth of Nations, people see him as this great, the right celebrates him as this great figure and
Yeah,
father of capitalism and certainly economics. And in that book, he talks about how it's easy for for business entities and their owners to organize because there's only a few of them, and they can go for weeks without sales and get by on their stores or on their cash. But workers can't do that, and there's lots of them, and so the workers get pushed around by the owners. Like Smith talks about this very openly in the
yeah.
book. I quoted in my book.
Cool,
And
man.
also
Yeah.
Frederick Douglass said the emerging capitalism of his time was the system of wage slavery. He said it was as
Yeah.
bad as chattel slavery, which is an incredible thing for
Wow.
Frederick Douglass to have said.
To have said that,
Uh,
yeah, yeah, yeah.
it's fascinating stuff. So looked at it in that way, it's capitalism that needs to justify. Because all of these great, like humanitarian figures from the 19th and 20th centuries, from these ugly centuries, all these giant evil regimes and their enormous, awful crimes. We have figures like Orwell and Douglas and Einstein, who we see as this inspiration. Guess
Yeah.
what? They're all socialists. So it is like reputable.
Yeah,
for people
it is
to
reputable, right? And I was talking with someone the
think.
other night, and they just said that socialism is the most vile, evil system that has ever existed. But then you bring up names like this, right? And I guess they're all wicked people that want to impose misery upon others. I mean, that can't be. That
Yeah,
has to be
these idiots are all
false.
talking about like Stalinist
Yeah,
fascism.
right. It's that again. It's that
And they think
20th
they're being
century
relevant.
talk. Yeah, it's
Yeah,
that.
and
Yeah,
they're
right,
coming
right.
closer to describing the regime they'll build when Trump comes back in and slams down.
Yeah,
We'll
yeah,
see who ends up being the great authority.
right. All right, Rob. So question 7. We kind of touched on Mondragon very briefly, but if you could just talk about worker co-ops, like what is a worker co-op?
Oh, right on.
Yeah,
I'm mostly interested in this just as it represents ideas of economic democracy and stuff. I'm not a big expert on co-ops.
right. Yeah,
Co-ops are very impressive renaissance in these these structures in the U.S. and the Western world over the last couple of decades. Very impressive. Tons of different models and practices, but all about having again, it's all like invested ownership, or you're working there, you're part of the co-op now, so you have a shared, you get a ballot in our big decision making and stuff like that. Now, often co-ops take place on a much smaller scale, which is fine. Like lots of economic entities are smaller, especially for consumer goods. People love their little produce stand and their little street food spot and
yeah.
their small little spa and this nice little wine. People love like their fun little stores for things, right? So
Mm,
for consumer goods, like you can't have enough richness of choice. And so like a co-op model is kind of nice for the part of the future socialism that produces consumer goods on that very small, bespoke, little clientele scale. People love that. Like that should be preserved. Like that's something that if we had democratic control over the economy would be easy to do.
mm.
Instead, it's very hard to do because you're competing with giant corporations like Amazon that can crush you as soon as they notice you.
Yeah,
And
right.
also,
Yep.
where's your health insurance going to come from? Like that's the obstacle to people starting business in America is you won't have health insurance. You'll have Obamacare plans, which are insanely expensive and give you nothing. And maybe
Right.
the only people I know who can start businesses have people who have healthcare through their spouse. Like I'm not exaggerating. Like that is everyone I know who started their own business commented on how they had to get healthcare from someone.
Wow. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Like
I've heard
these are
that
the
too.
things, they're limiting our freedom. Like that's markets limiting our freedom. We should have that
Right.
available as a public good, so we're freer in that manner. So like for big things like insurance, providing internet and oil and train service, like these things are the kind of things that need big national planning. You may need to nationalize or otherwise have a removal of power of ownership of those assets from some scumbag like Warren Buffett, who owns a big rail monopoly out here. they're regional monopolies, but that is what matters in transportation. It's
Yeah.
fascinating how these systems break up. Every market does its own evil kind of oligopoly. It's interesting.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
shouldn't be their control. So like co-ops might not be able to manage an economic activity on that scale. Like there you're going to need representatives and stuff like that who can go to like the meeting and then report back, because we're talking about entities that to be efficient and to operate efficiently and keep us in goods like we want. None of us wants to give up much of our standard of living. Like we want, like we said, I want luxury. We want luxury communism. We want the lights to stay on and the internet to stay fast. I would just love it if Warren Buffett and Bill Gates weren't in charge of the society. Like that would be smooth.
Right.
So that's
Yeah.
the thing there. Like
Right.
the co-ops can be useful for those small, bespoke, especially like local or physically existing consumer goods oriented economic entities in the future. But for big stuff, I mean, that's where you need economic planning and a national vote and shit like that. And like, how would you do this exactly? How would it be done? Every country is going to do it differently. With these kind of big social conversations, we should be talking about principles and what we'd like to see done. Everyone's going to do it differently, and that's beneficial. Then we would have experimental data and see what works better.
Yeah.
That's the real, that's the smart way.
Cool, man. I did want to add one more question in. I didn't put it in here. I'm not sure why, because it's another really common one. But socialism is just about big government, just about more government controlling your lives. What do you think about that?
Big government is such a fun thing. I talk to conservatives about this all the time. Big government, like that's a nice summation of like what libertarians and conservatives want to believe. I want less, and it's true for
Smaller
the
government.
economic nation. They want
Right.
less taxes on themselves, less taxes on the rich, who are the job creators who give them their jobs.
Yeah.
They want less regulation, so it's easier to dump waste because they don't believe the environment ever needs any help or anything like that. And those are all government provided entities. But on the other hand, like it's always really nakedly partisan. Like I know a lot of libertarians, and some are consistent, and don't support wars and stuff. But in my experience, most libertarians are conservatives who are bored and don't want to sit with their another Reaganites. They say I'm a conservative. As soon as 9/11 happened, or 9/11, like as soon as there's an Iraq war.
Yeah.
Or someone we want to drone somewhere, like as long as it's a conservative administration in power, like conservatives are always very excited about big government blowing up some Arab family somewhere that we thought were terrorists, but maybe they aren't.
Right.
And so we blew them up and scared the hell out of everybody, and then came back and hit the site again. We do these double tap shots all the time. We blow up the first responders. It's like the most satanically evil stuff in the world. Everyone's very excited about the troops and blowing up people overseas.
Yeah.
That part of the state, everyone just can't get enough of it.
Yeah.
The right hand of the state of this, as they sometimes say, the conservative hierarchical parts like the military and stuff like that. But then when it comes to like the left hand of the state, like providing pensions or national health care or a program to deal with climate change, that's big government. I don't like that government.
Yeah.
But companies all the time say we shouldn't have welfare. Like that takes people out of the marketplace. It makes them dependent. The Chamber of Commerce, all they ever do is demand more subsidies. The big organized business lobbying entity, the Chamber of Commerce, they were just pushing for a couple 10 billion in subsidies to build up a domestic ship industry the other day. These entities got their taxes cut just 4 years ago by Donald Trump and said that was going to bring out all this new investment. 4 years later, it's like, oh, we don't have this industry and that's not strategic. Can we have $20 billion? It's kind of funny. People talk about big government. It's whatever part of government they don't care for. And of course, all of these conservatives are just very, very excited about government telling women when they're allowed to get rid of a pregnancy. Most women who get abortions have had a kid, like it's people who can't afford it, but we're happy to force you to have that fucking kid because we're going to get rid of national abortion rights. It's people say big government. It's you should pick that up like it's a rock and beat it.
I also think it's important too that there are so many self-identifying anarchists within socialism that loathe the government. So that can't be the case, that it's just all about big government, because there's so many anarchists within the tradition. Yeah, I like that. I do refer to that in the book too. Socialism's like cousin ideology is anarchism, which I'm sympathetic to. I come out of sort of the Chomsky strain of socialists. We tend to be more libertarian socialisty. We also would like to see the state go away once we don't have capitalism anymore, which needs the state to restrain it. Right.
You can think about these things as stages over the long run of history and stuff like that. I think it makes some sense. But anarchism is a close ideology. I mean, how can that possibly be?
How can that? Right. Yeah.
Like we're trying to use the big government entity to stop all these other huge power centers in our economy, from energy and pharmaceuticals and transportation and big tech and Wall Street. Like they're so powerful. The federal government is the one that's the single biggest one of all. Like,
Right.
together,
Yes.
they're more than a match for the state, but it can do them one at a time. Like there are things that can be done, but it takes like thinking about power centers and what these things mean. And
Yeah.
people are very, very lazy. I mean, a lot of people today too, liberals and conservatives, like they may have bad ideas, they may be bad thinkers, they're not good at critical thinking.
It's true.
But usually it doesn't matter because they're lazy whips. Like most people don't step outside their comfort zone and they read things that basically agree with the way they view the world already. I read a right-wing newspaper every day. Like it's you can get out of what you believe and look at this stuff.
Yeah.
But usually people's laziness kind of prevents anyone from engaging with this. And they can
I agree. And
bullshit.
I talk to a lot of people, and they'll say, "Oh, Fox News told me this," or CNN. I'm like, dude, you have to really start reading these big names. You have to start breaking open the books and reading the literature. You're not going to get too far if you're listening to Fox News and CNN and these big corporations, these big biased corporations. So,
Just remember, that's big economic private companies speaking to you. Like they're
exactly
going to tell you like everything.
Right.
They're at least not going to tell you the bad things they did, at the very, very least, and probably more.
Yeah. Right.
It's reasonable. So you can at least plant that in people's minds, but that just makes them generally skeptical. It doesn't really help them like figure out who to be scared of or who's
for sure. Yeah, man, I agree.
It is tough. It's difficult to talk people back down to earth. We've
seriously.
Difficult.
Okay, man. Question 8: will there still be wealthy people under socialism?
There's different versions, and you can easily see that. Like for me, think it's reasonable to talk about like, a maximum wage, like maybe we may still have a currency system, perhaps in some places or some stages of this. So you can argue about how essential that is. I mean, I think at least when we're in the beginning of the process, like hang on to some currency and everyone gets roughly the same amount, like that's the kind of key idea there. But if you're making remuneration as part of a job or a job complex, whether it's democratically organized or in a co-op or however it might be working, I think it's reasonable for there to be a wage cap. Maybe like the highest wage you can earn is 10 times the lowest wage. And that still gives you like quite a bit of room to make more money than other people, but it puts a real ceiling on how much money and power you can pile up, or make it 5 times, you can argue about the number, but like that's like an interesting idea. Remember, half the reason we used to tax these people so hard in the New Deal era, when we could pay for things, not have a deficit all the time that gets used to defeat social programs.
Right.
We used to pay for these things by taxing these guys in the 80 and 90% on their very highest levels of marginal income there, like very fairly punishing progressive taxes, but not just to fund all of our programs of social uplift and bridges that didn't use to fall down. We do that stuff to take money out of their hands because it limits their power.
Right.
And once these guys have tens of billions of dollars, like there's no stopping them, like they can push they can play states against each other and stuff, man.
Yeah.
They're way too much. So there's like 2 reasons to do it. So relative wealth could be someone who's got 5 times the average income. But I think like that's wealthy. That's plenty. You're rich enough, you bastard. And maybe some people need that to be their best. As long as there's no like meaningful breakup in people's broad feelings about equality and no like power. Again, that's what really makes a class system, is who's in charge of
right.
Not necessarily who's like getting more treats, although that's in there. It's like who dictates to who. And that's what we've been sort of getting at, talking about.
Yeah. The power structures. Right. Well, this kind of segues into my next question. Maybe these, high taxation rates. A lot of people will argue that businesses will just leave America, and that would be detrimental to America. What would you say about that?
Yeah, it's a common problem with capitalism. It's very difficult because these are independent power centers. These are corporations that can move. They're often legally able to do that. So they will. Like that's a great point. It's like saying, well, if you ban slavery in the States, people are going to take all their slaves to another state. The answer isn't to go like, oh, okay, let's just let them have their slaves.
Let's let them have their slaves.
The answer is like, oh, I guess we should just ban this thing completely. Like, I guess the problem here, you're right. We have to deal with it completely or we won't be able to ruin this problem. That's a really good point.
Yeah.
Again, usually there's a historical parallel to any argument that people will make against like a progressive social change. And it's fun to throw that in their faces if people are looking for ways to confront conservatives who troll them. Bear in mind, conservatives used to be against, mixed race marriage and banning slavery or letting women vote, or getting kids out of factories, So throw that in their faces, don't let them forget what they're, this is the world they're trying to bring back and sort of succeeding. So it's a great way to, have something to say back.
Yeah. Okay. So the second part of that question, people, hold on one sec. So they'll argue that America will no longer be a global power. What do you think about that? Do you think it's good that America is a global power, or should there be no global powers?
Yeah, well, that's an interesting question. Historically, in the kind of the modern period, there's usually been a dominant global country, Britain and then us. I don't think it's so great the way the countries relate to each other. Usually, trying to see who's on top. So many people die over these countries having little wars, like hot wars or proxy wars or whatever. I don't think most Americans love the idea that America is on top of the world and we decide what happens, but I don't think most people feel like they get a lot of benefit from it. Maybe people think they do. I don't think that's very common, though. I think it's more of a bragging rights kind of thing in the eyes of most Americans. The Brits had a better case, like say, a bigger world empire that was more nakedly extractionist on a national line. The United States hugely benefits from third world poverty, but it's mostly our wealthy class that owns financial assets that benefit from trading or owning the debt of the developing world. So I don't think people feel like they benefit from it. But as far as the U.S. being the biggest global power, I mean, we will remain the biggest global power for some time. Like China in a decade or so will have a bigger GDP than us. It's important to remember what a limited thing that means. They have a much bigger population. It's a poorer country and will be, despite the fact that it will have a bigger total GDP than us. Their GDP per capita is significantly lower. And any visit to the country, you'll see these things, although the strides they've made in public wealth and infrastructure are incredible. It's what happens when a society only adopts a little bit of capitalism and is an independent developmental state. That's the kind of thing that the United States worked really hard to prevent from happening over its entire era as the world's biggest power. Any kind of independent country, whether it's a socialist experiment like Cuba or a right-wing Islamist government like Iran or whatever it is, if it's independent of the global capitalist system with US military bases, we've overthrown that government or undermined it or put them under sanctions for 60 years like Cuba to keep them poor for eternity. Because again, you can lock people out of the world economy. Well, that goes a long way over many years. So the point is, people shouldn't be so. Right now, the U.S. is again explicitly reorganizing its global policy to say we will confront the rising challenge from China. No one says they're threatening to attack us or kill us, because they're not.
Yeah.
They're challenging us by also being a big entity, and they want to dominate their region. The thing that big, powerful countries often want to do, like Russia is trying to dominate its region a little bit in Ukraine. I can't believe they're trying to do that. At least it's a neighboring country that they're trying to muscle around.
Right.
We do this on the we invaded Iraq on the opposite side of planet Earth from us and put tens of thousands of troops in there to defend ourselves. We don't really have a lot of credibility in the rest of the world. Americans tend not to be aware of this stuff, but especially after the Iraq War, and countries like North Korea, because they have enough artillery to resist war or destroy South Korea, they can avoid being overthrown. But Iraq got rid of its WMD, so it got overthrown. We've taught horrible lessons to the world. Countries are trying to get WMD because of us, because of countries like us and Europe and Israel that are constantly undermining countries that don't have a giant, dangerous bludgeon to threaten them, to use as threats to defend themselves with. It's not such a great tenure. And I don't know what it'll be like having China as a regional power. I hope it doesn't lead to, people don't realize how many times we've almost had nuclear wars with Russia already over our nuclear arsenals and little confrontations, and just over fuck ups, because we have so many hundreds of these warheads each, so many thousands of them each. China's modernizing its warheads, so are we. Trillions of dollars are involved. That could be your healthcare. Instead, it's edging us closer and closer to almost blowing ourselves up. People have no idea what a nuclear war would mean. If you think about it at all, it will ruin your day. I think about it all the time, and it ruined all my days. So I'll tell you. So the point is, we shouldn't want more confrontation. Most Americans want a bigger role for the UN and mediating conflicts and shared global negotiations. Great ideas. Most Americans have a good attitude on this. I wish we could get the U.S. government to follow those wishes.
Cool, man. Okay, that was a good response. 1 second here. Got to get my fireplace back on. Okay, so question 10. This is the last question here. What if workers do not want to own the means of production? In other words, maybe they like hierarchy within the workplace, and different roles come down to different abilities. Maybe there's just people that say, hey, I don't want that responsibility. I want to put that in someone else's hands at the top.
Sure.
Something I thought about a lot. Yeah, it's
sure,
something I've been thinking about
totally.
a lot. Yeah.
That's a view that exists, and companies certainly work hard to encourage it. Like we're happy to handle it. You just get to go home at the end of the day.
Yeah, right.
We definitely think about it all the time on our yachts, so we cash our big checks. It sucks. Like that's the thing, and it's something about being a democratic socialist. Like I wouldn't want socialism to happen against the will of like the people in America. Like if they don't want it, that means it's like a coup, not a revolution. That's not good. So if you want, I wouldn't want socialism to happen without everyone wanting it. So to me, it's about like educating and organizing so people can see the ideas and like get a better sense of them or read about them and see how it represents this big heritage. So lots of very like prominent and important humanitarian figures have recognized the value in. But if workers, when they vote down a union, I mean, should take that seriously. I mean, it's a very lopsided thing, union elections. It's a all the campaigning has to happen in the workplace, and companies can do private meetings. Your boss can sit with you and tell you how terrible it's going to be, like one-on-one. It's a terrible environment. But if you can't get that election through, it's very difficult to make the case that these things represent the public will, and then you don't have public buy-in. And it's like, this is the kind of thing you can't impose on people. The kind of the left hand of socialism is people who feel like you only want nationalism and big things like that to happen once you have big majorities of popular support. Otherwise, everyone freaks out. It's a propaganda victory for the right wing and stuff like that. So if it comes out the workers don't want it, then we'll continue to have capitalism instead, and we'll see how that goes. That doesn't look too good right now. My opinion is if you ever gave people a chance at this, they jump, but this is not something that's ever offered to them by the system. We have very limited polling on socialism, but even with zero media support, remember, media are private commercial entities. They belong to big corporations.
Yep.
Call them liberal or even socialist. It's ridiculous. They're socially liberal. They want to be diverse and so on. But they don't care about, they want capitalism. They want private ownership. They're private entities. They make money from ads.
Yeah.
On social media, there's zero positive mention of socialism, and yet half of Americans under 30 support it. It's amazing how much support it has.
That's true. Yeah.
Zero media support.
Zero media. Yeah. And it really is just frightening how much they control what we see. I mean, that's huge. And a lot of people don't think about that. Just what we see. I mean,
absolutely. It's hard to imagine, what's a bigger seat of power than controlling the information people get.
Yeah. Absolutely.
When I want to make the point that, some capitalists and big corporations have power, I say, like, you can be Rupert Murdoch and you own and build a TV network and you completely change the terms of debate in a major country. If that's not power, like then what is power? Like that represents the ability to change what happens in the world, And those commercial media, like their successors now are the big tech platforms, because most of us get our corporate news now through posts on Facebook or Twitter or Instagram or something like that.
Yeah.
So like those platforms are sort of the successors in the capitalist media world in terms of gatekeeping, to use a term that used to be good and that people have ruined, but that can filter and limit the ideas that people get, and they tend to limit out things that people ideas that they wouldn't like. So in my second book, Bit Tyrants, and actually a paper I'm working on right now with Noam Chomsky, actually the famous media critic and scientist, we're just trying to make a little article extending his and Ed Herman, the late economist. They had that model, the manufacturing consent model. We're just extending that out into the tech platforms and just showing that its relevance is very much still there. It's the same corporate filtering, just now with two layers. Now you're getting it from Disney's CNN and Google, Alphabet's Google, like through multiple platform filtering at a time. It's only more relevance.
Did you say you're working on a paper with Chomsky?
He's just giving me some guidance and some commentary.
Wow, that's great, man. That's really, really awesome. Yeah, I like Chomsky a lot.
Oh, he's fantastic. He's a great figure. Yeah, I turned 93 this week.
Yeah, 93 years old. He's I think Thomas Sowell, the other economist, he's 92. I'm not sure if you're a fan of Sowell at all. I imagine he's antithetical to your vision, but
I'm not as big of a fan. Yes.
Yeah. Have you read Thomas Sowell, a lot of his work? Or?
Oh, just articles, not full books.
Okay. Yeah. I have all of his books. I've read a lot of his books. I like both Sowell Chomsky. Obviously, differing views, but there's
Sure.
some merit in both of them. But
That's great. Yeah. Well, Chomsky is definitely a close figure to me.
yeah,
He blurbed all of my books. He's a very generous guy too.
wow, cool, man. That's great. So yeah, I think that's it here, Rob. I really appreciate you coming on. I hope we can do this again soon.
No problem, man. My pleasure. I was fun to talk about the big questions.
Yeah, for sure, man. All right, Rob, take care.
Yeah, take it easy, Eric. I'll see you
Okay.
later.